for being here on this lovely Friday afternoon. It's 2:02, and I will call this meeting of the City of St. John Finance Committee to order. And just before we get to the business, really for folks at home who are watching, just a bit of I guess a reminder and a refresher. Our former city solicitor, John Nugent, used to every couple of years give us a reminder of hats that we wear when we sit on different committees as council. And for those who are tuning in, just a reminder, this is Finance Committee. So while the Finance Committee is made up of councillors, we really are tasked with looking at the material before us today with a finance lens. So I'll just, I guess, tee things up with that reminder as we get into things. So we have minutes of May 26th to approve. Can I have a motion to approve the minutes? Councillor Hickey and her worship, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Contrary minded, carried. Item 2.2 is the minutes of June 9th. Her worship moving them, seconder. Councillor Hickey, all in favor, aye.
Aye.
Contrary minded, carried. Item 3 is the approval of the agenda, which was circulated. I don't think we've had any additions, so if I could have a motion to approve the agenda.
Move to approve the agenda.
Thanks, your worship. Councillor Hickey on the second, all in favor, aye.
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 Contrary minded, and carried. Item number 4, disclosures of conflict of interest, if any. Not seeing any indicated. We'll move on. Item 5 is the consent agenda. I could have somebody move items 5.1 and 5.2.
I'll move 5.1 and 5.2 on the consent agenda.
Thanks, your worship. Councillor Hickey with the second. Are there any questions about that material that was circulated in our kit, the updated procurement card policy or the budget timelines for 2022? I'm not seeing any question. Oh, go ahead, Councillor Radwin.
Just a quick one, because just wondering when the fire review is being completed. I don't know if that would have any effects on our budget or not, but it could.
There's our CEO, Mr. Collin.
Through you, Mr. Chair, to the councillor, the fire service review will be completed by the end of the year. It's a 15-year strategic plan. We do not anticipate it having any direct impact on the 2023 budget. We already know what needs to be in and out for the 2023 budget for our fire department.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions on the consent agenda? All right, we've had it moved and seconded. All in favor, aye.
Aye.
Contrary minded, carried. Business matters under item 6. 6.1 is the general fund long-term financial plan, and I will refer that to CFO Fudge. CFO Fudge.
Good afternoon. Thank you. So, yeah, thank you very much, Chairman Sullivan, members of the Finance Committee. We were last before you in, I believe, the last Finance Committee meeting, I think in May, with a long-term financial plan update. And as the committee is aware, the long-term financial plan is a living document, and that is actually prescribed in policy. So within the long-term financial plan policy that council would have approved, it obligates staff to come back at least on an annual basis, which we should be for any long-term plan, to adjust for changes in assumptions driven by economic factors, could be financial factors, could even be service level changes that council would like to see that wasn't considered in the last financial plan. So we continue to work on that refresh of the plan with the goal of having an updated plan for this Finance Committee's review by the end of the year. But before we can move any further, we need to seek the feedback of the Finance Committee on setting some key goals and targets that will be critical inputs that will drive costs in the plan and be critical inputs in sculpting this plan. So your feedback this afternoon will give rise to us returning to the Finance Committee in Q4 with an updated plan. And once we have that updated plan, if Finance Committee recommends that to Council by the end of the year for approval, and then we would actually come back in Q1 of 2023, because of course no plan is worth its salt unless you measure it and report on it. We'd come back in 2023 Q1 with our financial health scorecard, a dashboard that tracks our actual results, the targets, and measures our progress, so the Finance Committee can see that we're making improvements in meeting the desire and the goals of the plan. So essentially, planning is bringing the future into the present so that you can do something about it now. And in 2019, the city's first long-term financial plan was put in place. And really the goal of that plan, I mean, the challenge before us for that plan was to set the city on a path of sustainability. You know, the challenges were certain. We knew what was ahead of us. And we formulated strategies to tackle them with the city manager's sustainability plan and the process we went through to understand our options. So the challenges that we would have gone through are on the slide before you, and you're no stranger to what all these items were. And I believe we succeeded in meeting these goals. If you look at the things that we've done, we eliminated the structural deficit. We were able to reduce our tax rate to $1.71, which is the lowest in over 20 years. We now have wage and benefits budgets that are aligned with our wage escalation policy. So we have contracts now in place with the outside workers, the police association, the fire union, St. John Transit. We are now reducing our debt, and we have measures in the plan to increase our capital from operating, to reduce our reliance on debt. Our infrastructure deficit is reducing, and we're meeting that target. We're on track for that target of 25% reduction, and we've built up our reserves as we talked about in prior meetings. So as we measure the performance by tracking actual results compared to our targets and transparently report on our progress to hold ourselves accountable through this process and through these reports. And you'll see in the next couple slides a lot of green, which this Finance Committee should be proud of, because green means we're meeting the goals and objectives of the financial plan. I won't go in through any of these in detail, but certainly we're on track. So now in 2022, I can say that the long-term financial plan is just as important as it was in 2019 when we had that financial crisis and we dealt with that financial crisis. But I would say the financial plan is just as important for very different reasons. And I'd say that one of the main reasons and themes for this financial plan is uncertainty and needing to mitigate the city's vulnerability based on things that we can see coming before us. And some examples are on the slide. Now, we do have a process of municipal reform underway. That's going to look at things like our unconditional grant, which represents 10% of our budget in terms of revenue. We're going to have regional cost sharing and RSC models, which we don't really have a lot of information on how that will affect our budgets over the long term. We have tax reform that's been committed to for 2025 over this 10-year period. So there's a lot of just in municipal reform items that we need to understand that we don't have for certain before us to embed into this plan. We also have rising borrowing rates or interest rates. And this week, if you've been paying attention to the news, the Bank of Canada raised the benchmark rate by 100 basis points in one shot. And that's the largest single interest rate increase since 1998. And they're doing that in efforts to combat record-setting inflation. We're seeing inflations in the United States as high as 9%, exceeding 9%. It's been 7%, 8% in New Brunswick, all caused by supply chain disruption. But all these factors have an impact on the city and our affordability and our service capacity, from fuel to parts to commodities like road salt, asphalt, to the capital budgets that you approve. And just to give you an example, just in fuel, the city budgets approximately $3 million in fuel per year in the general fund. If that goes up 10%, what's $300,000 that we're looking at? And that's either, trying to find an offset somewhere else, or trying to get more efficient in how we consume fuel. And sometimes, there is no other option other than to consume the fuel the way we're consuming it, or looking at other ways to mitigate that deficit. So we are halfway through the year in 2022, and we are currently 40% over budget on fuel, which is a deficit to the budget of about $650,000. And so that means 75% of our fuel budget's been spent, and we're only 50% through the year. That's one item. So we constantly track and measure and report on our forecasts for that very reason. We want to make sure that we're going to come in on budget. So these are things when we have unpredictable economic conditions. These are challenges for a 10-year long-term plan, and which makes it even more important to update these plans on a very readily basis. Some economists are predicting a recession may be on the horizon in 2023 with a potential correction to market values. We don't know if that's going to be the case, but if there was a recession or a small recession, that could have an impact on the city's tax base and property values. We know that council's moving forward with a very ambitious 10-year strat plan, which has over 140 initiatives. That will require resourcing over the next 10 years. And there's items in that strat plan that include affordable housing, new North End neighborhood plan, catalytic projects, technology investments, list goes on. And not to mention the fact that we're still, it's not on the slide, but we still are in either an endemic or a pandemic. That hasn't gone away. There's new Omicron variants, and there's new waves that are coming. So we don't know really. The future really is uncertain with respect to that aspect as well. So all these items to an extent bring some uncertainty, and we're going to have to make our best guess estimates in making assumptions in this plan to formulate our forecast and just keep on top of it. So this is just a sensitivity analysis on our unconditional grant. And with respect to if there was changes to the negative on our grant, the grant represents about 22 cents of our tax rate and revenue. So a 10% reduction in that grant, you can see on the slide, 50% reduction would be 11 cents. So it's a very significant revenue stream. It's part and parcel to our overall revenue. So this is certainly something we're going to want to have line of sight on, engagement with the province and through the process with the 8 cities to make sure that our interests are understood and our positions are understood with respect to the importance of the grant and what the grant is meant to be, and what we see the future goals of this grant process potentially being. Inflation, you can see here on this slide, really just a sensitivity analysis of inflation. So, we're at 7%, 8% inflation. Well, 6% inflation on our budget represents about $2.5 million. And you either tackle that through reducing service levels or finding offsets or being more efficient. But I guess the bottom line is, in this environment of high inflation, very difficult to estimate on a long-term basis. So we will be making assumptions and coming back to the Finance Committee with respect to those assumptions. So you'll see the 2022 long-term financial plan updating these assumptions are critical. Our current plan has tax-based growth assumption of 1.5%. We're going to look at that to see if that's still reasonable. We really don't have a lot of intel. We had years of really stagnant tax base, and we had one good year of tax base last year of 6.24%. But then I just mentioned the challenges that are on the horizon. So we're going to have to make our best guess on what that assumption should be. I talked about inflation. We're going to have to embed into this budget, this plan, St. John Energy benefits. We have an agreement, an MOU with St. John Energy to share the benefits from Birch Hill and sustainable energy projects. So that will be embedded. We do have new flexibility with respect to heavy industrial differential property tax rate flexibility that will have to be considered for this process. I talked about our borrowing rates. Our financial policies will require some amendments, and then our targets require recalibrating. And that's really the intent of this presentation, is get some feedback from the committee on targets that are established in this plan, or that will be established in this plan. So you'll see just on this slide here are over our next 10 years, some of the objectives in the strat plan in terms of redeveloping projects or properties, a city market strat plan, incentive programs, different initiatives over the next 10 years that will require investment by the city. I'll just flip through that very quickly. These things will all need to be considered in the update. And then our policies, we identify these as the main policies that will require updating in the plan. The wage escalation policy, the capital budget policy, the debt policy, the reserve policy, and the grant policy needs to be approved at council. So now we'll get part of the presentation where I'd like to get some feedback from the committee. I brought this slide before you at the last meeting just to give you an idea of the tax rate in St. John compared to the tax rates in other communities. You'll see that our tax rate is approximately about 30 cents higher than Fredericton, but 16 cents higher than Moncton. We also have a target of $1.57 as a tax rate in our long-term financial plan. And so with that in mind, we'd like to have some feedback from the Finance Committee on what the Finance Committee believes is a reasonable target to refresh for the updated financial plan. We are recommending we maintain the $1.57 tax rate target just as a staff recommendation, and we really want to hear the feedback from the Finance Committee for a few reasons. One, we don't believe it should go any lower because of all these uncertainties that I've already discussed, and in conjunction with the fact that we have a strat plan that is going to require investment, and also the strategic plan itself has language in there that sees that the city should remain competitive with other communities in New Brunswick with respect to our tax rate. So with the strategic plan having that language, with the items I just mentioned, we are recommending this $1.57 be maintained. It's a critical assumption in the plan. It drives obviously a lot of revenue. And I'd like to pause here right now and hear the feedback of the committee on with respect to whether you agree with that particular recommendation.
Thank you, Commissioner Fudge. Getting a little echo. Comments from the committee. City Manager, get your hand up. Then we'll go to the mayor.
Mr. Chair, yeah, it was just a follow-on comment to everything that the CFO mentioned. On a couple of occasions throughout his presentation, he said, and or find additional efficiencies. Of course, that is something we would look at, but I would just want to caution Finance Committee, and I think everybody gets this. The city of St. John went through a period of over a decade where the tax rate was not increased despite inflationary pressures. So there was constant cost cutting and efficiencies found during that period of time. And then we also went through the sustainability crunch where we found another $10 million of efficiencies. So I just want to caution the Finance Committee that from my perspective, the notion of finding additional efficiencies for offsets, it would be very problematic and very challenging. The old adage of we've already remove the skin down to the bone or shave the ice cube is certainly applies in my view. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Worship.
Thank you. Kevin, I would probably go along with what you as a CFO would maybe recommend. I have a bit of a struggle with all of this because I don't know if a lower tax rate will get us what we want. I know it's good for probably better for attracting business, but we do keep 100% of residential. And as long as we are the major industrial city from the Gardner-Pinfold report, we know that will drive our residential population out of the city to a quieter, what they perceive to be safer, less impacted by heavy industry area. So I don't know if a lower tax rate will get us what we want. And I guess what is it we want? What do we want? We have the lowest rates, I think, in the Atlantic region. I think I read that in regards to our electricity. That's not a story that attracts people for us. People use the tax rate, I find, as a palatable reason why they don't live in St. John. I don't believe it's necessarily true, so I'm somewhat confused about that, so I'll just leave my comments there.
Yeah, if I could respond to that, those are very good points, Your Worship. I guess from my perspective, when I brought forward this, if you look at the previous slide, I guess the slide on, maybe it's the slide I have up here, this tax rate. I really looked at the draft strategic plan as well. I think the tax rate target is something that the Finance Committee has to consider, and all your points are valid. When you look at the draft strategic plan, there's a couple of lines in there. One is increased competitiveness, and the narrative is continued focus on tax rate reduction to be competitive with other maritime municipalities. So I really took that as some input as part of this process. And then the limit increase in tax burden. Continued increases in property taxes will strain taxpayers' ability to pay. So I really looked at those two items that were in the strategic plan in conjunction with the fact that our current financial plan has this target with the recommendation, but certainly open to this Finance Committee providing me different direction with respect to some of the valid points that you made, that you just made right now. Thank you.
And like I said, I'm just not sure if it'll get what we want. Thanks.
Councillor Hickey, over to you.
Thanks, Chair. Kevin, I guess it's very interesting for me because I think we've spent, certainly my tenure on council, which is not that long, but really looking internally at our finances and assessing them that way. And now it seems we're switching gears here to an understanding of a lot of our threats being external. And I guess with that, is there an understanding in your case that growth rate target of 1.5% is too high given what what the external environment may be like? I mean, I think it's pretty well generally accepted now among financial analysts that we're headed for a recession. What kind of recession is unclear, but as interest rates climb, our tax base may not grow at the same rate we're hoping it does. Not to say all is doom and gloom, but I wonder if that is a consideration beyond just saying, we're a little worried about it. Is it a target we would actually change?
Absolutely. No, that's a great comment. We certainly would not be, this is the current target for tax rate. We certainly cannot reduce our tax rate unless we get the growth that we need. And our plan is not to reduce the tax rate at the expense of service delivery or current service delivery. That's certainly not the case. And, the plan we had done in 2019 was relying on at least 3% tax base growth per year in order to be able to achieve the objective of getting down to $1.57 over time, over a 10-year period. So certainly isn't, make or break get to $1.57. We've got a community to run. We have service delivery to deliver. With respect to your question about whether 1.5% is reasonable, I would think it's reasonable, but I guess the theme of and I would think it's reasonable to achieve more than that. But I guess the theme is we are in very uncertain, uncharted waters, and we really need to be careful and have, strategies in place to reduce our vulnerability and increase our flexibility in event that's not what transpires and takes place. So the plan will be flexible enough for us to adapt, to be nimble, but yet achieve the goals of the council. So yeah, it's service delivery is important, and it's not achieving tax rate reduction at all cost.
Sure. And was there an understanding, or was there a schedule for that tax rate reduction beyond the target of 1.57 by 32?
Yeah, so the last plan would have went to up to 2030, and you would have seen in the plan iterative reductions over time as we garnered growth, getting to the $1.57 by the 10th year, essentially near the 10th year. Okay. So it is really based on the growth projections and meeting those targets. So it isn't an immediate, definitely not an immediate measure for us to go to $1.57, and we'd still have other challenges such as infrastructure we need to replace. We also have a special pension payment that falls away in 2028, which gives us lots of opportunity to do other things as well. So it's all part of making sure this plan is comprehensive and that we know where we're going.
Good. And I guess I just toss this out there for the public. You know, this is not doom and gloom. This is us assessing risk and ensuring that our plan meets that risk. I'm confident the city of St. John is well prepared going into this. You know, because of our long-term financial plan and because of the previous work, you know, this committee and council did, I think we go into a situation of external risk, whether it's a recession, whether it's inflation growth, what have you, that is ultimately quite positive.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Councillor. Councillor Radman.
Thank you, Chair. Through you to CFO Fudge. I definitely would love to see our tax rate go down because I think it does make us more competitive. With that said, I think, we always have to keep in mind those challenges that we have that, I'll say that Moncton and Fredericton don't have as far as like our geographical size. So once again, this is just one of those reasons why, reforms are so important, tax reforms for St. John. We have such a huge area to look after and to be able to provide, I would hope some competitive services like Moncton and Fredericton, but we have such a larger geographical area to look after. So that's one thought that I end up having. We aren't really competitive right now because of our tax rate, especially because of the smaller, regional partners that we have such a lower tax rate. I don't know. I'm kind of like the mayor on this. I'm not sure that tax rate is the reason why people are leaving the city. Or have left the city in the past. And I feel like a lot of people are starting to move back into even the Central Peninsula since so many changes have been made. So that's I think we're seeing a positive shift there. Be interesting to know how many people moved out at one point and are now moving back in. I kind of wish that we had that data. I wanted to ask you a question too. How much of like this macroeconomics do you take into consideration? And I'm talking like more on a worldly scale when you're doing a financial plan for the city.
We keep our eye on it quite closely because, in particular, when 80% of your revenue is driven by property, and the market for property is driven by economic conditions, and when you've got $30 million to $40 million of goods and services that include fuel and things that are subject or at risk to inflation, and capital programs that are directly impacted by supply chain disruptions that drive costs. We're seeing cost. I mean, you've awarded cost at council. You've seen some of these projects come back at 30-40% higher than budget due to supply chain. You drive by a car dealership, there's no cars on the lots. So there's certainly conditions that we need to keep our eye on. And they definitely affect our ability to fund services. But that's the point of looking long term. You can see these things and you can formulate strategies to address them and protect the organization. And we constantly update because these are assumptions. And the only thing I can guarantee is we'll be wrong because these are assumptions. These are assumptions. And we can update, and making sure that this committee has the best information possible to make decisions.
Yeah, and in me talking about how many people have moved in, I know that when I spoke with Mr. Wilbur about the Wentworth, for example, he said there was very few people that moved into that building that already lived in the city. They were coming in from the outlying areas, so that's good news. So I do kind of wonder, so why are people moving into the city? Why are people moving out of the city? It would be kind of good to know what the rationale is there, because I think a lot of people move for different reasons, and tax rate might not be the driver.
Yeah, and there's residential assessment, there's commercial assessment as well, and companies sometimes when they have an opportunity to invest between Moncton, Fredericton, and St. John, they're going to want to put their money commercially and invest to get the best bang of their buck and best return on investment. So I think we're not making any pre-assumed assumptions about what drives people to live in cities. It's really about being competitive. And that's actually, on the slide, it's really the tax rate reduction is really to increase our competitiveness. And that's really the goal.
It's fair. And with inflation, I know there are people struggling to pay their taxes. So if we can do any better for people, then we should certainly try.
Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor. Councillor Norton. Your mic, you are muted, Councillor Norton.
Talking to myself again. In Kevin's last statement, what he said at the tail end is really kind of where I'm at. I don't believe that anybody's making any assumptions as to what drives growth. I think growth is a big wheel, and there's many spokes. And one component of that is tax rate and maintaining competitiveness. And it's just one tool in our entire toolkit. And it's a component of it that I don't think that this committee should press the abort button on. It's one that I want to continue to pursue. It's one that I think is a good news story. We see how it plays well, even by a cent. It boosts confidence in not only in our market and in investment, but it sends a strong message that the city of St. John, as it relates to City Hall, is getting its financial house in order, and it makes us less susceptible to criticism from those people that may have been critical in the past, where St. John has overspent and hasn't been able to take care of its financial house. Whether or not we believe that to be true or not, it's a good weapon to have to fight that negative commentary. So I'm very supportive of the target, the principles behind it, and it's something that I want to see continue. I don't think it's a silver bullet. It's multifaceted, and I think Kevin has already alluded to that it's not making assumptions that this is the one thing that's holding us back. We've got people that are moving into condominiums. We've got people that are residential. We've got people that are commercial. We've got all kinds of mixes and a wide variety of demographic. But this is one goal that I think is something that we need to endeavor to hit, and it's moving in the right direction. So lots of pressures. I guess there's lots of pressures to keep us from pursuing it and even considering it. The cost to deliver services, fuel, all those things that we know about. But I think this is one where we hold firm, at least as it relates to this wheelhouse. So, I'm one small voice in that, but it's something I'm passionate about as it relates to let's keep going here.
Thanks, Councillor. For my 2 cents, Kevin, if I'm going to pay money for 4 years of a university degree, I should refer to it once in a while. A former deputy mayor who was also my marketing prof at UNBSJ, former deputy mayor Reinhardt, taught me about the marketing mix and, product, place, promotion, people, and price as being the things that go into marketing your product. And certainly, I would say 100% when you talk about our product being our city and our people working for the city, I'd put them up against anybody anywhere else. I think our promotion folks are doing a good job with St. John and the towns by the bay. I talked at council about the gentleman I met who had moved to St. John from Campbellton because he just loved the water and loved the fact that we have a freshwater river on one side and the Bay of Fundy on the other. Certainly a competitive advantage we have that nobody else can replicate. The products we have here, gosh, it's summer in St. John. We've got 506 going on, the Container Village. My social media is already starting to buzz about Moonlight Bazaar. We've got a West Side market on Wednesdays, a night market on Thursdays, Queen Square market on Sundays. The product people in St. John are putting out, again, second to none in the Maritimes. And then it's our price. And I am so glad that our draft strategic plan speaks to our competitive price. Because, and I don't know how we message price all around, because the mayor is right. St. John Energy is a jewel, and how we continue to celebrate the work that they do and the benefit that the citizens of St. John get from their work, because that is an important price advantage. But then, again, competitors will point to our tax rate, and competitors will point to our water rates as not being competitive. And I think it's an important target. I am of the belief that the moves we've made, not only the small move that we made last year in reducing our tax rate, but the fact that we are authentic, that we put it in our plan, and we are working that plan. I think Councillor Norton used the word confidence, and I think that's important when folks are looking to purchase a product, and in this case, to move their family or their business to the city of St. John. They want to have confidence that it is a well-run city, and part of that is showing that we are able to develop a comprehensive plan and follow that plan. So I don't think we changed the target. In fact, by keeping the target at $1.57, but moving this out to 2032, is actually already softening the target a bit in my mind, right? Because the original target was $1.57 by 2030. So if we're saying $1.57 by 2032, that is already softening it a little bit by buying it 2 more years. So I'm comfortable with that, because I think the backup of the strategic plan coming forward and saying moving towards a competitive tax rate, once that is in, that will help continue to guide us as well. So for my 2 cents, I think we continue on the path we are going. I think it is building confidence for folks not only who live in St. John and work in St. John and have businesses in St. John now, but as part of the overall strategy to continue to recruit folks and their businesses to St. John. I think it's important, and I think it is serving us well. So my 2 cents on the tax rate.
Thank you. Would it be okay to move on to the next slide, Chair?
Feel free to move on.
Excuse me. So the next target I'd like to talk about is our reduction of the infrastructure deficit by 25% over the next 10 years. We will have better line of sight on this one. Currently, Mr. Yamin, who oversees our asset management group, is working on updating our state of the infrastructure report. And it's through that SODI report that we identify whether we've made significant improvements in our infrastructure deficit. It's also through that report where we identify whether we're able to make some policy amendments with respect to the percentage of new versus renewal. So as you know, right now, our capital budgets have an 85% renewal requirement and a 15% new requirement or threshold. And that's really to make sure that we're diverting funds to needs versus wants when we have such a high infrastructure deficit. We're hopeful that that comes down, the infrastructure deficit comes down, and we're able to change and recalibrate those 2 percentages. And from a service delivery perspective, that also is helpful for council in achieving your 10-year strategic plan. So right now, with respect to not having that information yet back, we would also suggest we continue down the course of keeping this target at 25% from 2022. So, it's not softening the target, it's continuing a 2.5% reduction per year of the infrastructure deficit. And we achieve that by maintaining our target to increase pay-as-you-go by $1 million per year, so we could have more money to fund infrastructure, but also address our debt needs as well. So with that, I'll stop and get the feedback from the committee if there's any.
Your worship, go ahead.
2 thumbs up for me on this one. I love the fact that we're using the asset mapping, because it always defends our decisions at the end of the day of whether we go forward with investment or not. So I'm good with this one. Thanks.
Thanks, Your Worship. Councillor Radman.
Thank you. I'm a big fan of this too. And Kevin, I was just curious, do we have any idea how much interest that we're actually paying annually on our infrastructure deficit? Do you happen to know right off the top of your head? I don't.
Well, we're not paying any. we're not paying any on our infrastructure deficit because we're not paying for that infrastructure deficit. That's the issue. We have have too much infrastructure that we're not able to fund. If we were to fund something, we would
we're not
borrow a
talking.
lot of money.
We're not talking the debt, we're talking infrastructure deficit, like as far as the buildings go. Okay. No, I'm sorry, I kind of got lost on that one, I guess. I'm sorry. Yeah, I mean, this is actually huge when you think about, you know, for example, I'll just kind of think about the aquatic center, the TD station, things that are, you know, that need some work, and we're trying to maintain it, but of course everything costs so much. So this is definitely something I think that is already kind of in the plan, but it's just something we would end up maintaining, right? Is this something that's already in our financial plan, the 25%, if I remember right?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. So I mean, it's something that I remember, you know, when you know, Commissioner Hugenholtz would come forward talking about some of the buildings. He would talk about what was the most urgent, and you know, and so we're doing this, and to not continue doing it could actually end up snowballing into a big problem later on.
Yeah, and also we want assets to get to the point where we're not in a reconstruct mode and it's costing us more in our operating budget to maintain assets. So it's really another reason we need to keep on top of our infrastructure deficit. It does also have an operating budget implication. I see the city manager's hands up as well.
Mr. City Manager?
Mr. Chair, this is not to at all detract from the staff recommendation to maintain the target, because that is certainly the recommendation. The challenge that Finance Committee needs to be made aware of is that the level of ambition expressed by this council through its priorities, and that it will be expressed by this council through the 10-year strategic plan that we are taking a look at right now. The reality with that level of ambition is that the magical formula we have right now of 85% on existing infrastructure, 15% on new, will not satisfy that level of ambition, period. There is just no way to do it. So that's why it is incredibly important for us to do the asset management work that we're undertaking right now, to see if we can modify that percentage balance and still achieve the overall infrastructure deficit of at least 25% over 10 years. Because right now we have two different desires of council: one, addressing the infrastructure deficit; two, a fairly ambitious strategic plan, and they do not line up. So there's still a lot of work to be done here. And as soon as we get that asset management study complete, there will be an important decision of council at that point in time. Thank you. To this Finance Committee, of course.
Thanks, Mr. City Manager. Councillor Hickey, Councillor Norton, any comments on these two? Shake from over there. And Councillor Norton?
No comments. No comments. Okay. Just supportive in principle. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. I guess for me on this, Mr. CFO, we've got to stay on top of the infrastructure deficit. You know, and this one, it's so important, I think, that we have it in the plan, because that's not something, you know, nobody's going to come in front of council and pitch us a great idea about sewer separation and how important it is to increase the size of a pipe for a subdivision. But if we don't do it, then we're digging up roads in the middle of winter because of pipes breaking, and we're all in reaction. It costs us more in the long haul. So somewhere we need to recognize in policy that we stay on top of it, and I think this is the place. And the pay as you go, you know, folks who maybe haven't been in the city as long, if you're watching, there was a point in time not that long ago where there was zero pay as you go in our budget. It had been entirely stripped away in order to help chase a growing structural deficit. But what that meant was we were borrowing more for all of our capital, and this is what we were protecting against times like now, a 1% interest rate jump. Thank heavens we have this. Our pay as you go now, Kevin, we are 4 million.
Yeah, it'll be, if we follow this plan, we'll be up to 5 million in 2023's budget, operating budget.
Okay. So that would be $5 million in capital that we would be doing next year that we aren't borrowing for. And the more that we can do that, Councillor Radwin talked about interest concern earlier, the more interest we avoid. I mean, that is good business if we keep doing these things for the long-term financial health of the city. So, notwithstanding the city manager's comments when we get all of the input that comes with the strategic plan, for now, I think we need to maintain these and looking forward to Mr. Yamin's report as well, because certainly that input will be key. You're probably ready to move on.
Yeah, thank you. Wage escalation policy. We are going to be making some recommendations with wage escalation policy. And what we're going to be recommending is that, it really, when you look at our overall revenue, 80% tax, property tax, 10% unconditional grant, that's quite a lot of revenue. And then 10% of additional revenues through user fees. What we're suggesting and is that really the overall ability for the city to afford wage escalations really based on the overall revenues of the city. And, property taxes is one, but if you don't have complete control over that other 10%, 10 to 15%, you may end up becoming a bit vulnerable if it's just based on tax base assessment and growth. So what we're recommending is to take another look at this and amend the wage escalation policies to such that it's based on overall total revenue. This also allows the city to, if you're increasing tax rates to fund more services, it's looked at under a different light, or if the tax rate needs to come down, it's looked at as a total revenue calculation based on your goals, your objectives, and the total revenue the city has. What we do recommend is that the current policy in place, which is strictly based on tax base, would be grandfathered and honored in any specific language that's been inserted in collective agreements. That would continue to be paid as such based on the formula that has been approved by council, but we think it's prudent moving forward that those commitments be honored, but the future wage escalation policy be amended so that it's reoccurring revenue, by the way, because we could have one-time revenues that occur during a year that won't happen again if it's just based on total revenue. So I guess I should amend my language to reoccurring revenue that we would base this wage escalation policy on. So with that, we would have to update our operating budget policy and our wage escalation policy and bring back recommendations to the Finance Committee. But I would certainly like your feedback on this item. Thank you.
Thanks, CFO Fudge. Comments from the committee? Your Worship?
I agree with that. I think that I like it that our policies are not static, and that as we move through the process of applying them and seeing how they apply and the consequences of them, that we are willing to, reinvent them and update them or whatever. So I'm good with this. Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks, Your Worship. Councillor Radwin?
Thank you, Chair. I've always struggled with wage escalation policy because, in theory, I understand why it was put in place and everything, but I'll be honest, as we get growth and that ends up equaling out to wages, like the increase in wages, your growth that you're getting, is most of it going to wages? So I've struggled with this. I've struggled with this one because, I would like to also think that the more growth that we have, the more services that we can end up putting out there for residents. And I would also like it, for us to have a little bit more potential to maybe not necessarily have, and I know this is kind of probably a hot topic to say, but for maybe not such large substantial wages going out there for staff, but maybe even more positions for other staff to be able to help, especially, because I understand sometimes staffing pressures. And So, for example, our customer service center, maybe they need more staffing. I know that, we have one traffic engineer. So to be able to have another position there, I think brings a lot of value, not just for the residents, but also for staff. So I'm kind of looking at from two ways. So I've struggled with wage escalation. In one way, it is fair for staff. In another way, I think that it does not benefit them too, because I'd like to see other positions put in there to be able to help them more easily do their jobs, and then in turn to give more service and benefit to taxpayers. So just keeping that in mind going forward. I'm not sure how this has to be framed up, but I'd like to see a change in the wage escalation policy.
Yeah, those are great points. Thank you for that. And I'll just rewind the clock a little bit. When we initially brought forward the wage escalation policy, this was really a budget policy. It was a way of capping our budgets, not so much, specifically to wages and benefits for, a particular group, but it was a budget policy to say you got finite amount of money driven by tax assessments, property taxes, grants, those things. It was mostly focused on assessment. And that finite amount of money, you need to make sure that your wage and benefit budgets are within what you can afford. How you do that, whether it's adding staff, reducing staff, using it as a tool of negotiation, that's really up to the City of St. John to do that on whatever strategy they think is best. If it's a strategy to have bargaining units negotiate that formula into their collective agreement, that's a strategy. That's a tool that you can negotiate with. But the policy itself does not require that to be the way we move forward. The policy just simply is there's a ceiling. Don't spend more on wages and benefits than the revenue you bring in, because if you do that, that's how you get into the structural deficits of the past that we've had. And that's really the main purpose of that policy.
That's great. Thank you. That kind of clarifies things a little bit more for me. Thank you.
Mr. City Manager.
Two quick additional footnotes from me. First of all, the wage escalation policy, we always speak about the guts of it, and that's what we did here again today. There are other small aspects of it that are important. For example, throughout the wage escalation policy, it's made quite clear that for a compelling business case, the wage escalation policy can be modified, or there can be an exemption granted to it. So it does not tie the hands of council completely, but it certainly gives us and imposes on us a certain level of discipline in terms of wages moving forward. The second point I would mention is that, and I've heard this sort of rhetoric being discussed by some, that suggests that, well, that means all of our new growth goes towards wages because their rates go up in accordance with growth. That is simply not true. For whatever increase in growth we have, only approximately 50% of our budget goes to wages and benefits. The other 50% does not. So if you do have an arbitrary number of $1 million in extra revenue in a given year, at the most, only about approximately 500,000 of that would ever go towards wages, because that's what our wage and salary benefit is of the entirety of our budget. The remainder of it would be available for other purposes. So I do think the wage escalation policy provides some flexibility in terms of how we achieve the ends, as the CFO has described, but it also it forces a certain degree of discipline as we move forward in our discussions about wage increases and adequate compensation for our workforce. Thank you.
Councillor Norton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick question to the CFO. Is the idea behind some of this that this does this incent the workforce to a degree?
No, it really isn't meant to incent the workforce. It's really meant to make sure, again, to make sure the city doesn't fall into structural deficits. So, okay. And that's what's happened in the past. When we brought back in 2017, when we showed you've got reoccurring revenue of so much, but expenditures that are 5 to 6 million more.
Yeah.
Because we lose track of that, and it's always making sure that we're affordable with what we bring forward for wage and benefit packages is really the intent of the policy.
Okay. Okay. All right. Okay. Thank you for that.
Councillor Radwin.
Just a quick question, CFO Fudge. What percentage of our budget goes to wages again?
It's about, well, if you talk wages and benefits and special pension payments, just 1 second. Yeah, it's about 55% of the overall budget when you include those three components.
Okay, so it's a substantial amount. Yeah, no, I was just curious on that. I mean, you know, I think these kind of policies are really important. And this is probably a great exercise, especially for the public to know exactly how this works. So no, thank you for this.
Mr. City Manager.
Yeah, if I could, I'd like to quickly go back to Councillor Norton's question. The intent with the policy was not to incentivize the workforce, but I can tell you in discussion with the workforce, it has to a degree incentivized them because they understand that their future wage increases are tied to growth in the city. And for some, that has motivated them to perhaps consider that a little bit more and work harder towards that. Again, I don't think, as CFO mentioned, it was not the stated purpose, but I think there has been a second order effect to a degree. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. City Manager. Actually, I remember when we first discussed this, not an exact replica, but I see it I see similarities to private corporations that have profit sharing plans or where employees own shares in the company. Because you're right, if the city does well, our employees will benefit. And if we have tough times, our employees share part of that pain too. I think it's very fair. Thanks, CFO Fudge. Feel free to move on.
The last target is debt reduction, and you'll see the consistent theme here until we get more, further into our modeling and come back with a plan. We are continuing to recommend a target of 25% over the next 10 years. We have rolled in, we're updating our plan to roll in the parking debt because we consolidated the parking commission into our organization this year. We want to continue to increase contributions to capital reserves every year as per the plan. I mean, one of the reasons why that's important, we've got some pretty ambitious projects. We have some catalytic projects that are big ticket items that we're going to want to save up for rather than rely on a lot of debt into the future. So those capital reserves play a big role in that. And based on the current plan, we're right now, if you look way back when we started, in 2014, we had about $120 million in debt in the general fund. We're now sitting somewhere around $96 million in the general fund. This 25% target would bring us down to about $71 million in the general fund. So that's where we're looking at. And then once we get to that level, we'll probably start conversations on about what is the right and sufficient sustainable level of debt. Because every organization needs to have debt. Every organization should have some leverage to make sure they're using their money and equity appropriately. But yeah, we would recommend, as for now, we maintain the 25% target and shoot for the $70 to $71 million target in 2032.
Questions from committee? Sounds like we're. Oh, Councillor Redmond.
This is the one that I wanted. Thank you, Chair. About debt, I was wondering, CFO Fudge, I think that the number used to be $9 million. Is that still how much we're paying in interest a year on our debt?
Maybe Mr. Levine can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we pay principal and interest in the general fund somewhere around $16 to $17 million. And I believe around $3 to $4 million of that is interest cost. If I'm wrong, Craig, please feel free to chime in.
That's correct, CFO Fudge.
Thank you.
Yeah, so that's a substantial amount of money. Very important to get a handle on this piece, in my opinion. I mean, we can do a lot with 16 million for projects. So yeah, I'd love to see this continue to go down. I think we'll end up in a much better financial state as the years go on, and we hold tight onto this one.
And for folks at home, this ties back to the one we were talking about earlier about paying more for capital out of our operating. The more we can do that, the less we have of debt. So we're still doing capital projects. We're just not paying interest on the capital projects. Very good. Thanks, CFO Fudge.
Thank you. So our next steps, we've received your feedback. I think we've got direction on where you guys are leaning with respect to these targets. We'll go back, we'll do some more analysis on various components of the plan. We're still costing out the strategic plan and incorporating some of that information. And then we'll be back probably later in the third quarter, early fourth quarter with a draft long-term financial plan for this committee to review as a receive and file, and we'll continue our discussions from there. So with that, it's recommended that the Finance Committee direct staff to continue with current financial principles and targets embedded in the long-term financial plan as part of the updated plan. Thank you.
I'll move the recommendation.
Councillor Radwin beat you to it, but you can second it, Your Worship.
I'll second the recommendation.
On the question, all in favor, aye, or wave.
Aye.
Contrary minded? Motion carried. Thanks, CFO Fudge. That takes us to 6.2, the grant to St. John Theatre Company. Mr. Fudge, back to you.
Thank you very much, Chairman Sullivan, members of the Finance Committee. The report before you is based on my office's review of the St. John Theatre Company grant request and the recommendation that we received from the Growth Committee. The reason this particular report, or this matter, I guess, was forwarded to the Finance Committee for your review, is the fact that the recommendation has budget implications. So there's budget considerations. Terms of reference for the Finance Committee is budget, and it's incumbent upon us to bring this back to you. Just so the Finance Committee is aware, I have met and reviewed the findings with both the chair of the Growth Committee and with the executive director of St. John Theatre Company before presenting here today. And before I go on, this is a really important slide that I really want to stress. The recommendation in this report is a very internally focused report. It's based on the city's processes, our internal controls, our policies, our best practices. This report in no way should be interpreted as any indication that the courthouse project or the St. John Theatre Company projects are not an important community project. Just based on my review, the St. John Theatre Company has served this community for over 30 years. I was actually very impressed as part of my review, doing due diligence on this file with the governance of their organization with respect to a very strong board of directors. They've got a very dedicated professional staff. They've got committed and very diversified donor base and sponsors. They've got extreme passion for the community. And I can tell you, as a finance person, I was very impressed with the transparency of their annual reports. If you have a chance, if you're interested in, financial things and annual reports, take a look at theirs. A lot of great information, audited financial statements, of course, but very detailed supporting information, including detailed lists of donors and sponsors. So I have complete confidence in the information I reviewed. And I also want to extend my sincere gratitude to the executive director who took the time to meet with me and was very forthcoming and open and answered the questions that I had asked of him for that meeting. So I really want to extend my appreciation to the executive director. So with respect to that, the report really is based on 3 different categories. And these are observations. The Finance Committee is a committee of finance. This is under a financial lens. I'll stress that as well. And so we really looked at it under 3 different categories. First, the financial business case. Second, due diligence. And then third, some governance observations before we get into the final recommendation. So the first area of the report being financial business case. I don't think this report is inconsistent with what you would have read from the Growth Committee report. First of all, when you talk about financial lens and reviewing a report, we're looking at things like financial return on investment, tax base, incremental revenues, safeguarding of assets, things that you would typically see on any review of any investment opportunity or grant for any organization. So those are the type of items you'll see in this report. I did correspond with Service New Brunswick for the first item, just to understand how assets such as theaters are assessed, and received information that the property would be eligible for application for exemption from property tax, which would be highly likely to be successful if there was an application. So if successful, the city wouldn't receive incremental property tax on this investment of $818,000. And without, obviously, with the primary source of revenue being property taxes for municipalities, it's very difficult to achieve a direct financial return on investment if that's the case. So that's really observation number one. Again, not inconsistent with what you would have read out of the Growth Committee report. Second observation was on the economic impact assessment, and I think this was an assessment conducted by Envision St. John. It was a tertiary level review, and in my estimation, it was based on the best information that Envision St. John had at the time. And so the detailed results of the EIA, when I reviewed them, it's really provincially focused. It's GDP, it's sales tax, it's income tax, it's provincial product tax. It wasn't very clear in our review what the economic impact assessment was with respect to municipal economic benefits. So in the report, you'll see that the EIA had projected on construction approximately $1.98 million in provincial taxes, and then another $1.67 million annually through operations in provincial taxes. Again, not to say there are not municipal economic benefits. I'm basing it on the review of the materials in front of me, so more information would be required, but certainly that's one of the observations that we saw. Third observation is, again, the EIA is an estimate. It's like our long-term financial plan. You're basing it on imperfect information and assumptions, and those assumptions get refined as you have better information. So we did determine that the EIA is based on the goal of achieving 100,000 visitors per year. We did confirm that a detailed assessment of the 100,000 visitors per year could not be undertaken at this time, nor are we clear on how much of the economic impact is based on new visitors versus migration of visitors of existing St. John offerings. Again, not to say that this isn't the case, but I guess in conclusion, we'd say further vetting of that assumption would be recommended to really understand really the economic impact assessment for municipal purposes. Fourth observation is that we'd highlight is that we don't have a clear line of sight on construction start date. Great work being done by the theater company, and great faith in them achieving their objectives. But at this point, not having the schedule on when that will be completed does have uncertainty with respect to when we would have this in place. So given the schedule and uncertainty, we would recommend that if the grant is awarded, that the entirety of the funds are restricted and held in city accounts until all sources of funding are secured by the theater company and construction starts, such that the taxpayers are able to generate additional interest revenue on those funds of $15,000 to $20,000 per year until such time the construction. So we would do that very easily by restricting and committing funds, setting aside not to be used for any other purposes through that process. So that's another observation and recommendation we would put in there. So in conclusion, on the first section of business case, finance would need to review a business case that includes direct or indirect municipal economic benefits to understand the financial value to taxpayers. Second section of the report is really on the category of due diligence. And the first item is the recommendation that the city review if we are to further proceed with this grant, St. John Theatre Company business plans. As we would with any investment of this magnitude at $800,000, again, it's not specific to the St. John Theatre Company, it's any investment we would make. We want to look at business plans. And a business plan can often be the single most important document you can present to an investor, because it provides an investor the structure and confidence needed to make decisions about funding and assurance of security of their investment. So as part of the business plan, we would look at, the things that you see on the slide, cash flow forecast, capital forecast, debt forecast, customer forecast, things of that nature, contingency plans, deficit backstop plans, things to really understand the sustainability of the service, not so much the business, but the sustainability of the service that's being offered. HST liability, again, this is not something specific to the theater company, and we've encountered this before with other grants. As the Finance Committee is aware, municipalities do not receive 100% of their HST back like private sector companies do. We receive an HST rebate, and our rebate is 71% of the HST that we pay. And often, sometimes when there's agreements in place and their position is grants, when there's conditions of those grants or conditions in place within those agreements in those grants or expectations within those grants, the CRA often looks at those grants as being services, and they're subject to audit and subject to coming back to saying, no, they actually are applicable to having HST. And we've had very, very real examples where that's happened before. And if that happens on an $818,000 grant, we would be subject to an additional cost of non-refundable HST of $35,000. So all this recommendation is not to reduce any grant recommendation that the Finance Committee would have. It would be within, whatever the commitment is or the agreement, to claw back and hold that amount of $35,000 until such time we receive assurance from the CRA that it doesn't attract HST. And if that's the case, then we would remit the remaining amounts of the funds. If it does attract HST and there is an additional cost, we would claw that piece back from the commitment that's been made. So that's the purpose of that piece on due diligence, is really understanding HST. So in conclusion on this piece, further due diligence is required, including a review of the business plan, just from the perspective of our investment, and an assessment of HST liability. The last section of the report is on governance, and we outline a number of items on governance. First and foremost, we take a look at the reserve fund policy. The reserve fund policy approved by council permits the city to draw out of reserve funds for various reasons. You'll see all those reasons listed on the slides. Major unanticipated unforeseen events, major capital renewal, future uncertain liabilities, one-time operating expenses that we didn't see coming, infrastructure deficits, and investment and growth opportunities. So it's really category F that we're looking at here today, investment and growth opportunity. However, as the report articulates, we would look to council to approve the criteria and define what that growth opportunity looks like. And if I could just move on to the next slide. As we have done with other reserve funds that are growth related, our recommendation would be that council approve the use of the Discover St. John funds. This is the fund, the reserve that we'd be drawing funds from in policy, so that definition of growth is embedded by council. They've had that opportunity to debate and discuss what their goals and what the evaluation criteria should be to use those funds, and that the grant request be evaluated under that lens based on council approved policy. So a couple examples that we highlight in the report where we have done this successfully in the past is, first and foremost, the Encore program. The Encore program was established, council approved the criteria. It was really meant to be a recovery for the community post-pandemic, to help different businesses recover. Those objectives were established. It was brought forward, that evaluation criteria was approved, and it was evaluated under those lenses, and projects were approved through that process. Same thing happened with the Strategic Real Estate Capital Reserve Fund. Council at first evaluated, the use of that fund, made recommendations. Then it was off to the races to the committees to make recommendations with respect to the criteria that we were established. And our final point would be, our observation is the growth opportunity should result in a measurable direct or indirect financial benefit, municipal financial benefit. And for us to assess that, we probably would need more information. Also, the draft grant policy, we identify that we do have a finance committee draft policy. It's not gone to council yet. It's still under the public consultation process and with our growth folks, but there is within that policy, once that is approved, there will be formal grant application process, eligibility criteria required, evaluation processes, and performance reporting requirements. So just want to highlight that because that has been before you in the past, the Finance Committee. This next one is more of a suggestion than a recommendation. We do make a suggestion in the report to explore with Envision St. John the potential use of accommodation levies for grant requests such as this that are future oriented, premised on drawing tourism into the community. The reason we say that is the purpose of the accommodation levy is to fund initiatives that will increase visitors to the region. And they are paid by hotels and other establishments that benefit from paying those levies. So this may be an ideal source of funding for future funding requests in 2023 and beyond, if working with Envision St. John as an observation to fund initiatives that will draw tourism-based projects, volumes, traffic, visitors to the region of the city, paid for by the businesses that actually pay the levies, who benefit from that. Fifth observation from a governance perspective, and this is probably the strongest recommendation in our report, is the recommendation or the request is a pre-approval of $100,000 per year for the years 2023 and 2026 beyond the draw from the reserve. From our perspective, as you could tell from the last presentation, with the number of unknowns the city has before us that have financial implications, and we can name them, I'm not going to, we just have, pre-approving budgets 4 years into the future, it really isn't recommended. So we would recommend a different or alternative way of funding this type of initiative rather than encumbering future budgets. And we've talked about all the issues in that last presentation on uncertainties, and that's really the reasoning behind this recommendation. Final couple of notes, just we mentioned in the last presentation, the strategic plan. We do have 140 actions in the strategic plan. We do need to cost them. We don't know all the costs of that plan yet, so we would, we would bring that to your attention. Also, the strategic plan calls for the city to maintain its current investments and operating budget in arts and culture investments. It doesn't call for a significant increase in investment in arts and culture. And we looked at Plan SJ and we saw languages such as encourage, facilitate, and support with respect to arts and culture. And finally, I think we've brought forward in the past information with respect to our capital budgets and needs. Over the next 10 years, we've received requests, whether it's asset management, infrastructure deficits, or just actioning our strategic planning, that we're going to need somewhere in the vicinity of $700 million over the next 10 years to fund these initiatives. Per year, that's $70 million per year. And currently, with other levels of government funding, we're really somewhere between $20 to $25 million per year in fiscal capacity and affordability. So really, this item is just to identify the opportunity cost with respect to, we do have a lot of needs internally with our infrastructure when considering third-party requests. So the overall conclusion is council should refrain from encumbering future operating budgets, explore the operating accommodation levy as a source of future grant funding, and approve evaluation criteria to support the use of Discover St. John funds. So our concluding observations, I think I've gone through each and every one of these. I don't need to read each of them to you, but this would summarizes the observations in the report with respect to the request from a financial lens and financial perspective. And the recommendation is that the Finance Committee recommends Common Council approve evaluation criteria in policy for the use of Discover St. John Reserve funds, and the St. John Theatre Company grant request be reevaluated based on council approved criteria. Number two, given the significant financial request Finance Committee recommends St. John Theatre Company submit a business plan as part of the evaluation process to allow the city to conduct further due diligence, really to protect our investment, but again, not specific to the theatre company. For any investment, we would recommend this. And Finance Committee recommends that the request for grants funded by the general operating budget in the years 2023, 24, 25, and 26 be referred to the budget process in those particular years. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, CFO Fudge. Questions from committee? No questions, then no, Your Worship.
I just have a quick question. Growth opportunities should result in direct or indirect financial benefits for the city. How like, what are we, I'm just looking for an idea of what you would consider an indirect financial benefit, and how would that be measurable? I mean, we've got quality of life issues that for some things, and then we say, you know, that would, I guess, result in an indirect benefit at some point in time. So I'm just kind of just looking for a little clarification on that. I am supportive of the recommendations.
Absolutely, great question. So when we say indirect, when we say direct, it's really direct revenues into the city of St. John. But you can have initiatives that actually, create new growth investments, that create spin-off investments by third parties, spin-off investments by companies who start up new businesses, construct new properties, create, buy new services from the city. And so those indirect activities create new revenue streams, financial revenue streams for the city. So it wouldn't be directly with the city creating that activity, but the indirect activity the city would see a financial benefit from. So it's, and I'm not actually saying this doesn't do that. I'm saying there's not enough information for us to assess in order to determine that.
Yep, that's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor Hickey?
Chair, I see the city manager's hand up as well. Maybe you want to go to him first.
I actually would prefer the councillors go first, but I would like to offer a few points afterwards.
Okay, back to you, Councillor Hickey.
Okay, thanks, Chair. Sorry, I just had to step up briefly for a phone call. Kevin, I had a question about the St. John Theatre Company's support. I know Stephen had reached out to, I think, all of council, essentially asking for an opportunity to present to our team. I wonder if that could be made possible, just so that we can make sure that that dialogue is as open as possible with them.
Yeah, I'll leave that to the chair to comment on, but I do say there's another touch point for the theater company. These are recommendations of
yeah. So I wonder if it, like, where it's not, like, where today we're not necessarily making like any check signing decisions. Like, maybe if we could table those recommendations until we can have a chance to speak with them or something.
Are you making a motion, Councillor Hickey?
No, I'm really just opening up for discussion to try and get some other perspective.
Fair enough.
Yeah,
fair enough.
I'm not well versed in the dynamics as to what's been gone on between staff and them. I don't know what the.
Just before the city manager chimes in, I just the point I wanted to make is there'll be one more touch point. Council has to make the final approval. Sure. And so certainly, that will be an open session presentation, recommendation from the finance committee. There'll be opportunities there as well for further discussion with respect to the recommendation. So, but I would refer that question over to the chair of the finance committee with respect to inviting the St. John Theatre Company to the finance committee meeting.
Yeah, and I'll just comment on that quickly, Councillor. Mr. Tobias and I had a conversation a week or two ago about this very topic. He was interested in perhaps presenting to finance, and with the material we have in front of us, it's really talking about internal processes and due diligence. And I just said to him, I said, I don't think the timing is really right when this is internal stuff that we're talking about. Sure. We aren't determining whether we think it's a good company or a good idea, right? We're looking at financial due diligence and risk and that sort of thing. So
absolutely. I guess maybe then, Chair, what we could do, and I see the city manager, so I'll let him speak. But all I just say is maybe we could, if we were to endorse staff's recommendations, but just include, kind of a pending, perhaps even a presentation to council when we go to make that decision.
Well, I think something I will do following this meeting, I'll circle back with Mr. Tobias next week just to follow up and find out what his concerns are and what his potential goals would be, and try to see if maybe finance is the spot, depending on his concerns.
Yes.
Or it could be, when the final recommendation ends up in front of council. But I think for what we have on our plate today, I think it's a process discussion for us. But I will certainly circle back with Mr. Tobias after the meeting. Did you have anything further on that, Councillor?
No, it was really I just wanted to make sure we had that discussion because, I understand the positivity behind this project, and I didn't want us to unbeknownst to us sideline things for him or anything like that. Yeah. So I just wanted to make sure that we,
I'll give you some of my concluding comments early, since you brought it up. We've got a really good organization that's communicating with us, who has proven over 30 years to do wonderful things for the city of St. John. And they're looking at a project that saves a historical courthouse on King Square and turn it into a theater. And this is one of the reasons I said at the start of the meeting, but we're the finance committee. So it's incredibly important for us to make sure we do our due diligence. We analyze risk. We analyze the business proposals to make sure that $800,000 of taxpayer money is being looked after. I mean, that's part of our business. Well,
and I recognize that, especially with this relatively being a new step for us, and not traditionally going down roads like that.
Yeah, and I think this is a good opportunity with a good organization to show just how important it is for us to continue to do due diligence, because the way the city did business in the past led to some problems, and we've got a financial plan and organization structure right now that is leading us down a very prosperous road. So I think we continue to trust the process. Mr. City Manager, do you want to let Mr. Norton go first?
Your call, Chair.
Councillor Norton, over to you.
No, really, not much to add, Mr. Chairman, other than the fact I do know that I believe that Stephen did reach out to all finance committee members and asked finance committee to waive off discussions as it related to this one. But I see this one as a process question, not a discussion as it relates to the courthouse in principle. So this is just really a process. And I think the CFO has made that clear in terms of how we, going forward, how we entertain proposals like this and how those are funded. Like this is purely a process thing. So, and happy that the chairman's going to reach back out to him. So it's already been said, and we've got a strong ecosystem in the arts and culture scene, and we see all those things going up, and there's no bigger quarterback for that than Stephen Tobias and the St. John Theatre Company, and really a top shelf board that's part of that. So that's all I have. It's just really high level commentary. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor. Councillor Radwin.
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate. I really wanted to hear everybody's comments. I was, I just wanted to first say, I love St. John Theatre Company. I just have a couple of comments, really. And, of course, I'm always pushing for us to have more things celebrated with the arts. Mr. Tobias has done some incredible shows like The Wizard of Oz, Sound of Music that I've attended, and they're just absolutely top notch. To repurpose a heritage building, I always have interest in that, of course. And to finish off King Square is really important too. However, I think, I think it's extremely important for us to also recognize that we have an expert sitting here, CFO Fudge, and, he's trying to ensure that the city is doing its due diligence through not just, to have a detailed business plan, not just to have forecast. Anybody can put forecast numbers in, but how did you get them? I know that the Imperial Theatre sells less than 5,000 tickets a year. And out of those 5,000 tickets, there's 1,500 people purchasing them. So how are those numbers going to come in? So, I mean, that's something that anybody who's going to do an investment would need to look at those details. The other thing is obviously having property tax exemptions. There's no ROI directly coming back to the taxpayers when this investment's made. It can have huge economic impacts. And I do want to mention that even though those economic impacts have been proven to be provincial dollars, that could trickle down into the city as well, you know, through grants that we would get through the province, whether or not they would decide to approve certain applications that the city would put or not, right? You know, so I think that this is really important that we follow these sort of financial advices, but I also want to caution you on us actually supporting a project like this, and I'll tell you why. We just talked about the infrastructure deficit that the city has. You know, we have a building over at Reversing Falls that we need to figure out what to do with it. The Barbers General Store had a fire. The Aquatic Center needs incredible renovations, TD Station, and the list goes on. So for me, I'm having a hard time to think about giving almost $1 million to a project, even though it looks wonderful and the design looks incredible, when we are not looking after our own buildings or struggling to look after them, we'll say. So that's just my comments there. But you know, with that said, I think the project looks fabulous, and I'm sure there probably is a sound business plan that we haven't seen, but it's just hard to give money. You know, we have a financial policy to say to look after your roof before you buy your living room furniture. And, you know, I would kind of spin this that, are we looking after somebody else's roof before we're even looking after our own? So that's just my comments that I have.
Thank you, Councillor Edwin. I think you framed up Finance Committee responsibility really well. City Manager. You're on mute.
Mr. Chair, members of committee, this is a very challenging one for council. First of all, at the end of the day, this is without doubt, and I think everybody recognizes it, a council decision to make. Secondly, before I begin my diatribe here, I do want to fully recognize the expert view that our CFO has provided. Kevin and I have spent a lot of time over the last month talking about this particular file and the various pros and cons and challenges associated with it. And I want to applaud him for having the conviction to come in and lay it out from a finance perspective. The challenge we have, however, and we need to recognize this, is we have a very divergent view between Growth Committee and Finance Committee at first glance. Now, I think it's important for this Finance Committee to understand that the original recommendation to Growth Committee was the $400,000 from the Discover St. John Legacy Fund. That was it. And as far as I am concerned as your city manager, it was an ideal fit for that money. Yes, we had not yet gone through the process of establishing firm criteria for that funding, but we did nonetheless evaluate it against what we knew the criteria would be, and it fits very nicely to use that Discover St. John legacy money for this sort of project, and that was our recommendation to Growth Committee. Growth Committee has said that they wish to do more. That $400,000 was not sufficient expression of support, and therefore staff went away and took a look at other possibilities, and the only other thing we could recommend was the $100,000 a year over 4 years, recognizing the challenges with that. That it was what Growth Committee has supported. We now have Finance Committee, a recommendation that you're about to vote on, that may be divergent to that. And in particular, it really is the 4x100s, the second 400,000. There's no issue with the rest of it. And in fact, the fact that a business case must be submitted before any monies would flow, and that we need some sort of concrete evidence that the project is going to go before we give the money, those are all prudent steps that we would have put in place in any event. It is the 4x100,000 the second 400,000, if you will, is where growth committee and perhaps finance will diverge. From your city manager's point of view, it's okay to have two different recommendations, one from growth and one from finance, go before council. And it could be debated at council and an ultimate decision made. We had already intended on Mr. Tobias coming into council to explain the project to the entirety of council and for the public record. Even though he has done that once at growth, Finance Committee has not heard that presentation in its entirety, and therefore the plan was always to have him come in and brief again prior to council decision. So I mention all that just so that Finance Committee understand that there is a divergence here between growth and finance. If finance supports the CFO's recommendation of not providing the other 4x100,000, alternatively, we can consider other things such as protecting that money up front, but those are other discussions that could be entertained. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. City Manager. Over to committee. What would you like to do? We have staff
I'll move the recommendation.
Worship moves recommendation. Councillor Radwin is the seconder. Comments, questions on the motion? Kevin, can you put the recommendation up, please?
1 second, please.
Yeah. No, Councillor Hickey's going to make comment too, and I think I will as well, but I need to see the recommendation again.
Can you see that?
Got it. Thank you. Councillor Hickey, over to you.
Thanks, Chair. I guess I'd just say I think, you know, within the context of finance, I think it's appropriate to support this. It ultimately does not mean that this is going to be the decision of council, and I think it will be worthwhile pairing it with the presentation from Mr. Tobias, because I think we can all recognize the importance of this project and recognize the significance of it, as you alluded to, Councillor Sullivan. I guess I'd just say that I plan to support staff's recommendation, you know, obviously pending that presentation and pending that conversation holistically at council.
Yep. Thanks, Councillor. Just a question or two for you, Kevin, perhaps. Recommendation number 3. I know it's a kind of a direct conversation back to the recommendation that came out of growth. I'm just wondering, you know, I think everything's got to be recommended to budget anyway. That's why everything ended up here. So I'm just wondering if that one might be a little bit redundant. And the other piece, and maybe for you to comment perhaps and committee to consider as an added recommendation, I don't know if we do the due diligence in here and the business case, but I guess a little bit of homework maybe to do as part of the process as well. I don't like I don't like encumbering future council budgets. So if this was to go forward, you know, do we need to put a recommendation formally in CFO Fudge, or is it something that your department would look after to say and come back with, you know, if this goes forward, the best way to finance it would be X?
I see the city manager's hand up.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, the challenge is that number 3, first of all, number 1 and 2 aren't tremendous issues. The first one is an administrative thing. I am quite confident that the formal criteria that we would develop would match up nicely with the St. John Theatre Company. We already did that work, but we just didn't do the criteria first. So I'm not worried about 1. I'm equally not worried about 2. We would have insisted on that in any event. It comes down to number 3. Growth Committee is recommending a commitment of $800,000. They want the commitment now. What number 3 is saying is 400 now, the other 400 to be determined. That is fundamentally different, and it's also fundamentally different to the theater company itself. they cannot really, with this if this recommendation were to pass at council, they cannot really be walking around saying the city is committed to 800,000. They would be walking around saying the city is committed to 400,000 with possibly more in the future. So there is a very big difference with number 3. Perhaps, and that's the role of staff here, and I suppose my role moving forward is, whether Finance Committee would be supportive of us going away and seeing if there was some middle ground here somewhere where maybe it's an expression of support for 100,000 in each of the outlined 4 years, but subject to budgetary approvals on a yearly basis. I don't know, but it is number 3 that is fundamentally different than what growth has intended. And I'm kind of the conduit between the two, so I felt it was important to communicate that. Thank you.
No, appreciate it, Mr. Zuanich. I guess, and I appreciate growth kind of offering a suggestion on how we might finance something like this, but it's in our name, right? We're the Finance Committee. So I do appreciate, taking money out of that fund and then looking to find another $400,000 and here's how you might do it. I don't know if that, and I'm not saying not to give them another $400,000 in my comments either. I'm just saying I'm not convinced that is necessarily the best way to find that other $400,000, and I'd like our finance folks to have a look at it. That's all I'm really saying. And I think and this is just me personally, I do think it's kind of bad practice to encumber future budgets, especially potentially 4 years out. Like, who knows what's going to be going on in the economy in 4 years. But that's not to presuppose that I'm saying don't give them a commitment to $800,000. I think CFO Fudge was pretty clear in his presentation that, if we find a way, if council ultimately decides to give them $818,000, we put that in a committed restricted fund for their purpose and just all those other bits and pieces that went with that due diligence. So that's really all I'm referring to. And it's not, I think 1 and 2 do the due diligence of whether we should or not and what the risks are and indirect benefits that will come with the project. I don't know. Maybe your finance department will come back afterwards to look at it and say, no, the best way to do this would be to create a restricted fund and drop $100,000 a year out of our operating budgets. I don't think that's what they would come up with. Just conversations I've had with CFO Fudge about future budgets and all. But maybe it is. But I don't think any of that would stop us from giving a commitment letter should council commit to the grant, saying that we're good for it, because I think we're good for it. Anyway,
I suppose, Mr. Chair, if I might, that's what's unclear to me right now is Finance Committee supportive of the second 400,000, but not in this multi-year 4x100,000 commitment? Because if Finance Committee is supportive of it, perhaps there's a number 4 that says staff go away and see if there's another way of doing this, and perhaps it is just a letter of commitment subject to budgetary consideration on a yearly basis. I don't know. We haven't done that work yet, but it's not clear to me as to whether or not this Finance Committee is committed to 400 or feels comfortable with 400 or feels comfortable with 800.
I think the conversation I have heard so far, and some committee members have their hands up so they can help correct me, but I think what I've heard is with our finance hats on, we've got a little bit more work to do before we say we're happy as a finance committee. At council, it'll be perhaps our council hats. But as a finance committee, there's some more process we would like to go through before we say that from a finance lens, we're prepared to move the grant forward. And it's not to say we're not either. It's just saying we have due diligence to do. But that's I think what I've heard, but I'll go to a few other committee members and let them chime in. Your worship, you're up next.
Thank you. I guess what I will say is that I am supportive of the 800 commitment. I'm on growth. I think growth, that's just, I guess, growth's idea of how we could get there. I'm comfortable with that to a certain extent. I do understand that budgets need to have some flexibility in them because you don't know what's coming at you, but those budgets are within the mandate of this council as well. So I wouldn't be committing to another council's budget. So I guess that's why I'm comfortable with it. I would like, it's a $20 million project. I would like to see the city make around this. You know, I do like John's idea of a commitment letter or whatever it is. It is a significant, and I think that in order for, when you want to chase private donations, you know, you need to know that the city is interested in this project and wants this project as well. And I guess that's a demonstration of our commitment. So that's where I am. Thanks.
Thank you, Your Worship. Councillor Radwin.
Thank you, Chair. So I guess that the way that I sit is I'm not in support of any money. And the reason why is until we fix the aquatic center, until we fix TD Station, until we fix the building over at Reversing Falls, high tourist traffic area, Barbara's General Store, and numerous other city assets. This is like me having my deck on my house falling apart and giving money to my neighbors to put a deck on their house. So, you know, I mean, I can give you all kinds of comparisons. I know that there is a, you know, that it's a great project. I'd be there celebrating the building as soon as it would open, but we just don't have the deep pockets of other levels of government. And so, you know, for me, this is taxpayers' dollars. And taxpayers' assets are not being looked after. So until they're looked after, I can't hand money. And there's numerous right now, not-for-profit organizations, mind you, that are looking to build new buildings or fix their buildings. And who knows how many people are going to come knocking on the door if this is approved. So those are just my 2 cents. I support the project in verbal support. I can't support it, unfortunately, at all, but we'll support the financial advice of CFO Fudge. But I mean, we just need to look after our own properties first. It's, you know, it's unfortunate that the pockets are not deeper, but if they were, then I might feel a little bit differently about it. But, you know, the aquatic center needs a complete revamp, for example. So until we can do those things, I'm going to have a really hard time to be able to commit taxpayers' money to this.
Okay, thanks, Councillor. Just before we go to Councillor Hickey, just a reminder for committee, what is on the floor right now is what is in front of us. The city manager introduced the idea of a commitment letter, and however, what we actually have on the floor is what's in front of us. So if we can focus the discussion on that, and if somebody wanted to introduce a change, you're certainly more than welcome to. But if I could focus the discussion back to the motion that's on the floor. Councillor Hickey.
Thanks, Chair. I was keen to, just based on city manager's comments, to perhaps propose an amendment that would essentially include his recommendation on top of it.
You care to put a little bit of wording to that?
Perhaps the city manager can.
I respectfully, and maybe I failed to communicate properly, I'm not prepared to offer another recommendation at this point, unless a referral to city manager to explore other possibilities other than the 4x100.
Okay. So maybe then John, just based on this conversation, maybe it's just worthwhile to go to council with this recommendation with the understanding that, you know, this discussion happened and we can work on it at council where we have the whole team together.
Yes, but in order to provide us the runway to do this, after you've debated and voted on this, I would recommend a referral motion to city manager to explore other options for the 4x100. And then if we have something, we can bring it to council, or not. If we really can't come up with anything else, then we would say that at council.
Okay, I will. I'll make that recommendation then after I vote on this.
Somebody help me out. why would we put staff through the work of 1 and 2 if we're just going to recommend to council a commitment letter for the 800,000?
Yeah. Chair, as a minimum, and this is why I said I'm unclear as to the will of Finance Committee. As a minimum, I think there has to be some sort of change to this that says that you are or are not supportive of the, well, actually, no, number 1 does it. If there's a general expression of support for the first 400,000, what number 1 is telling us is go away and do a fail-safe of the evaluation of the criteria. So we can go do that. I'm quite confident in the results of that for the first 400,000. The second one, like I said, we would do anyway. The question is, do we spend any time or effort working on an alternative, or is the recommendation of Finance Committee 400,000? That's it, no more.
Yeah, I guess that's not how I read number 3.
Yeah, that's not how I do either.
I just read number 3 as saying that we refer to the budget in those years, and kind of in general that's not a great idea. Like it just
the intent of number 3 is to refer to budget. It's worded in a way that spreads it over 4 years because that was aligned with the recommendation. But the intent of number 3 was just simply you have a designated fund that you're evaluating for the use to Discover St. John, and the recommendation is you should formalize that criteria in policy at council before you determine that is an appropriate use, and then reevaluate it within that. Now, council can decide whether they want to do that or not. The second is everything else is unfunded, unbudgeted. So you should refer to the budgeting process. It could be all in 2023. It doesn't have to be sculpted over 4 years, but the principle is anything unbudgeted, refer to the budget process so that you can holistically consider that spend in conjunction with everything else that you have to consider to make an informed decision through the budgeting process where you don't have that information right now.
That makes sense.
Exactly, but that means that the commitment to the St. John Theatre Company at best right now is the initial 400,000 if we reevaluate the criteria and council approves them. The first of the $100,000 in payments, and the second and third and fourth of those is not an assurance to the St. John Theatre Company. It's not even an expression of commitment to the St. John Theatre Company, and they will not be able to use it for the fundraising drive at this time.
So, Kevin, let me ask you this. What's the turnaround time on these recommendations? What do you think?
Well, it's certainly going to take some time. I can't speak for the growth committee. I mean, the first recommendation is to bring recommendations to council on criteria for the use of Discover St. John funds with the goals and objectives and evaluation criteria, have that approved. So how long that takes would be a question for growth staff, maybe even the city manager. The business plan would depend on what's available for us to review with St. John Theatre Company, and certainly typically isn't a very rapid process. It takes some time to go through business plans and projections. So we certainly would take some time to have to go through that.
Well, let's deal with the one we got in front of us, and then maybe we'll deal with part 2. Does anybody have any other comments, questions with regards to the recommendations that are on the floor in front of us? Okay, so I will call for a vote on those 3 recommendations. All in favor signify by just putting your hand up. That way I can see. So we got. Okay, so everybody's in favor. Contrary minded. Nobody's face palming the camera. Okay, so that is carried. Does anybody have another motion they would like to discuss?
Well, I guess I'm at a point where now, I mean, I do agree with that, but when I read it, I thought maybe that would go. But if we have no commitment, is there any way we can put a commitment letter for them? I mean, at $100,000, we're looking at to have growth at 2.5, et cetera. So I don't know. I would like to make that somehow. I would like to make some sort of a commitment to them of more than $400,000, I guess is what I'm saying. Maybe I'm crazy, I don't know.
Might be separate questions, Your Worship.
True, because I agree.
No, I think not speaking for everybody. I think, well, I'll just speak for me because I can do that. I don't get the sense that the committee as a whole wants to limit the St. John Theatre Company. I think I'm just saying I'd like to get the information back first. That's all we do our due diligence, and then once our due diligence is done, as long as everything checks out, we move forward in a manner that's recommended by staff as to how you best finance a grant like this. I guess that's kind of where I'm at. I'm still a little unsure of going through a process and having staff go through a process to look at criteria, look at the business plan, all those things, which I'm pretty confident, like, it's not direct ROI, it's a lot of soft ROI, but I think one of the strengths that St. John has is in our theater and culture. So I think you build on strength. So I guess I'm fairly confident, but confidence isn't analysis that will end up in the right spot. So I guess at this point in time, I would, just me personally, I wouldn't be prepared to go forward with a full commitment letter until we finish our due diligence. It's not saying anything other than I want to finish the process. Anyway,
Mr. Chair, if this helps, with this recommendation having now been passed by Finance Committee, and I know the other recommendation that was passed by Growth Committee, and there needs to be some harmonization and ultimately some decision at council level. What I would suggest that I will probably end up doing is dealing with number one right away. We can staff those criteria, we can get them before council, we can get council nod up and down, and then we can evaluate this submission based on those criteria. All of that work, quite frankly, has already been done informally. So okay, for us to do it formally is not a bridge too far. So we can do that right away. I can task the CFO to work with the St. John Theatre Company to understand the business case. And when that is ready, whenever that is ready, that will be available to be presented to council. And then the third part of it is whether or not we can find some common ground or what the staff recommendation will be to council. At the council meeting, the Growth Committee view shall be expressed. At that same council meeting, the Finance Committee view shall be expressed. And we're going to bring in Mr. Tobias, who will express his view. And then ultimately, it's a decision of council. Regrettably, there is more work to be done here because finance and growth are not aligned. That's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. We'll do the extra work. We'll present it all to council when we are ready, and council will make a decision. I think the first part of it, though, number one on the recommendations, we can do right now. The rest of it will take some time.
Thanks, City Manager. Councillor Radman.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to caution the City Manager on getting our CFO to be working with figuring out a business plan. I mean, if a business were to go to a bank looking for money, they'd have to bring their business plan and present it, period. Full stop. You know, yes, so I don't really want staff.
Oh, Mr. City Manager, please let her finish.
Sorry.
Yeah, I thank you. I don't really want like staff tied into the weeds of trying to assist in any way and trying to figure out what their business plan is.
Yeah, I did it again.
Yeah, go ahead. No, go ahead. I'm done.
No, I'm sorry for cutting in, Councillor, because I wanted to miscorrect if I said that. We will not help them write their business plan, not at all. We will ask for them to produce a business plan that we will review.
Yeah, okay. No, that's great. I appreciate that.
Your Worship?
I guess all I want to say is that, like I said, I'm supportive of the 800, but I wouldn't want to think I'm sending it to the budget process as an opportunity for it not to go into the budget. You know, so I guess, you know, if we had something happen and we really couldn't do it, that's fine, but I don't want it to be, you know, and just an opportunity to not do it. So
Yeah,
I guess I'm committed to it is what I'm saying. If, if that makes a difference, I am committed to it. So, and I guess that's what we're looking for from everyone, is to find out whether we've committed to that or not. It seems like that's where we're going, verbal at least.
I guess I'll disagree with the city manager a little bit. I don't think finance and growth are that far off. Like, growth goes through their processes and makes recommendations, and I think finance just needs a little bit more time to do our homework. I guess I would equate it to I'm prepared to hire somebody once I check their references, right? Like, we are doing our due diligence here, and I think that's important process as a city. As I said earlier, we're dealing with an organization who has shown success in repurposing buildings on Princess Street. I remember being there for that opening. Like, they do good work, and have been an important part of the city. We need to do our business when you're looking at $818,000 of taxpayer money. We need to make sure the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed. So that's kind of all I'm saying. I don't think finance is that far off. Anybody else have anything they want to add? So I think the sentiments are there, and I don't think. Thanks, Councillor. I'll get to you in just a second. I don't think if timing becomes a thing and all the work is done prior to our next meeting of finance, I would even offer that as soon as the homework is done, if we need to get finance together to say the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed and move things forward to help fit a timeline. I will speak for everybody else. I'm away at Canada Games, but outside the week I'm away at Canada Games, I'm happy to jump on a call anytime in order to help facilitate the process. Councillor Redwin.
I just wanted to share. I mean, obviously, if council's will is to give this money, then and they don't want to wait until the budgetary process, then where is it coming from, right? Finally, in the end, it has to come from somewhere. So where would the plan be? So is the plan for staff to go back and figure out, what's going to be cut in the budget, in the current budget as it stands, and making amendments there? Are we going to stop cutting more grass or put off a road project? Or, because it has to come from somewhere. So, to just put it on the table like that is a little bit, it's not fair to the budget. I certainly don't want us to go over budget, right? So I would kind of caution everybody on that. We certainly don't want to be over budget, especially with the inflation as it is right now, hitting around 7%, and the interest rates going up that can have a huge effect on the city. So, if this is going to happen, definitely my advice is make a plan for it to come from somewhere, because I don't want us to have repercussions of it putting us over budget later on, and then for us not to be able to do what we need to do in 2023.
Yeah, Councillor, I think we haven't had an emotion, but I think we've communicated that to our staff, and I'll get the city manager a Diet Pepsi, and I'll get CFO Fudge a coffee, and make sure we have that conversation, because I think that will help neaten things up a little bit as we go forward too.
Well, you know what they like anyway, Chair, so that's good.
Mr. City Manager.
Yeah, just for clarity, nothing would happen in the 2022 budget, so that we do not see any sort of in-year adjustment to budget 2022. We're talking about 2023 and beyond, and the other 400,000 is in the Discover St. John Capital Reserve, so there will be no effect on 2022. Yeah. We could not entertain that in any event, but there will be impact to 2023 to be sure. That needs to be looked at.
And we have, and I guess we didn't vote on this specifically, but we certainly had CFO Fudge's recommendation of a reserved fund that would hold this until they're ready to need it. I think that's in the report there. And, so that gets to the commitment piece, right? Like, in just, internally in discussions, how would we fund that commitment? And we just need to finish the process. Oh, good. It looks like we've worn everybody out. So if nobody wants to bring anything further on this one, I know we've got, oh shoot, my other screen died. So I think it's 6.3 on some really cool information on the procurement process. So CFO Fudge, over to you to introduce.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, members of the Finance Committee. It is a priority of Council in the City Manager's work plan that the city modernize its procurement policy. And the target is to have that completed by the end of 2022, and we're making great progress at doing that. I think we mentioned in a previous update at our last meeting, a cross-functional team made up of finance and general counsel professionals are working together to bring forward a modernized policy that safeguards the organization, achieves and redefines what the definition of best value is for taxpayers, reduces red tape, increases efficiencies, and implements recommendations within the Ernst & Young operational audit. So with that, I'm pleased to introduce the Director of Finance and Internal Audit, Ms. Jody Forgy, who is here, supported by her Procurement Manager, Chris Roberts, who's a wealth of information in procurement, as well by our General Counsel in Orlando Laneros, with the input from, we also, in consideration with input from expert consultants we've engaged on this project as well. The presentation is a receive and file, but we would very like the feedback of the Finance Committee for this particular item. And with that, over to you, Ms. Forgy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, CFO Fudge, and challenge accepted to get through this in 15 minutes on a Friday, because I really do want your feedback. So I'm going to share my slides now. Okay, so good afternoon, Chair Sullivan and members of Finance Committee. We are back with updates on our progress and updating the city's procurement policy. We provided an introduction to the project a few months ago, and here today we're presenting some of the big changes along with our draft recommendations. We expect to return at least once more with further updates before the recommendation to approve the changes is made. Careful consideration is being used in the updates to this policy. The revisions to our policy is a concept of removing red tape, but also the inclusion of accountability to ensure that we are not only economically responsible with our purchases, but also take on the responsibility to make sure we're socially and environmentally responsible as well. So as CFO Fudge mentioned, we have a project team, and every person on this team has played an important role. I do want to recognize that both Chris Roberts, our procurement manager, and Orlando Laneros from General Counsel are here today, and they have been very patient with me working through the updates to this policy. Really, they have been key in the recommendations that I am bringing forward today, and they'll be here to answer any questions you may have at the end. Also, it's important to recognize that having legal and procurement working together is fundamental. They'll help us provide the optimal outcomes for the city. So within the procurement department, I thought it was important to just recognize the core team. There's a team of 4, and they are the gatekeepers and advisors to all our procurement decisions. Combined, this team has over 80 years of procurement experience, both within the city and at other organizations. The team also continues to stay up to date on their education requirements and what is happening with other municipalities. Procurement is also an activity that almost everyone at this organization takes part in at some level. And as such, all staff play a part in making procurement decisions effectively and ones that have an impact. The policy updates will be very important to this process. In addition, active engagement with staff and the update to our procedures book will be a key guide to assist the organization in implementing the policy in practice. So when we reviewed the scope of this project, we determined that to make the best decisions on this policy, we wanted to have a third party assist us through the process. Staff wanted to find someone that was not just an expert in procurement, but also someone with significant experience in policy for social procurement. The consultant has reviewed the proposed policy wording and updates and provided a workshop to the project team, procurement staff, and engineering staff on social procurement practices. The first area of policy update is in our procurement methods, followed by the city. This one is one of the red tape reduction items. The current procurement methods described within our policy is very conservative. This leads us to an opportunity to continue to appropriately manage risks while implementing more strategic practices in our execution of procurement method process. The draft recommended changes will still follow all the applicable laws and have the goal of providing the overall best value to the taxpayers. So when we were researching the best options, staff performed various analysis of what was available. All of the options we looked at, all of the work we did led to the same solutions. We looked at what Fredericton, Moncton, and Halifax are doing by reviewing their policies and discussions with their staff. So before I dive into that, I first want to remind you of what our current policy is and what our legal requirements are. So along the top there, you see the applicable trade agreements we are bound by. So what this means is that within any purchase of those thresholds, we are required to go open competitive bid unless we have an exemption. So right now, our current thresholds are much lower than the existing legal requirements. Fredericton updated their policy in 2020, and within the policy, there is no thresholds described, and the procurement team with the purchasing department determined the method used up to the legal threshold limits. Moncton has similar thresholds to the city of St. John, but when we discuss further with them, they have indicated they will be updating their thresholds as well to reflect the new increased ones. Further to this, within their policy, they have indicated that they will ensure that the cost and time associated with using a competitive bidding process is proportionate to the benefits received. And also those 25, 50, and 100 limits we had were the old thresholds legally. Similar to Fredericton, Halifax has no defined thresholds for open competitive bids. They ensure they follow the trade agreements. So our legal counsel performed a detailed review of our policy, and one of the biggest areas of amendment from their opinion was also increasing our thresholds that trigger the implementation of an open competitive bidding process to be aligned with the statutory requirements. So here's the draft recommendation on the procurement method. Moving forward in our pursuit to be more strategic in our purchases means that purchases should be made first and foremost following the law, but secondly, in the most optimal way to achieve best value for taxpayers. Because the low dollar items won't necessarily trigger an open competitive bidding process does not mean that our goals as an organization change. In fact, our goal of providing a fair, open, and equitable approach will still be there, but it makes us look at the purchase and think about what is the best way to use our time to get the same outcome. So the draft recommendation is noted to the right, which will state that the method of procurement will no longer list the 25, 50, and 100,000 as guideposts, but will indicate that anything above the thresholds, which are legally bound, will go open competitive bid, and anything below will be decided by the procurement team. The decisions will still be guided by the best value and working in a fair and open manner. This could mean that many times under that threshold, the procurement department will still conclude that an open competitive bidding is the appropriate route to take. Similar to what we read in other policies, this will allow the city to incur costs that balance with the benefit received and to not overburden unnecessarily in relation to the procurement method, and to pivot our attention to being more strategic. Spending authorities is the next recommendation that we will be bringing forward. The current spending authorities are again conservative in comparison to dollar spend and what other municipalities have implemented. By increasing our spending authorities while maintaining appropriate controls to manage risk, it will allow better turnaround times by allowing the organization to operate within their approved budgets without the need to prepare and attend to council. In conjunction with our awareness of the need to increase the spending authorities, EY in their operational audit also validated this with the recommendations highlighted in the blue. So the two on the left there. The recommendations received were to increase city manager spending authority to $500,000 and increase directors to $100,000. We have reviewed their recommendations and have determined an amount that is below their recommendation, but will still achieve the goal of reduction to red tape. This slide shows our current spending limits in comparison to their recommendations from the operational review. Our limit for city manager is currently $75,000, and anything above is required to go to council. Our department heads, or the commissioners, are $25,000, and division managers, directors, are $15,000. Again, we looked at other municipalities and compared our spending authorities. As you can see, Halifax has a much larger spending envelope. However, they are a much larger organization. The closest structure to us is Moncton, and within Moncton, they allow for the city manager to have up to $150,000 for operating and $500,000 for capital. So beyond looking at them, we want to identify what number would provide the best return and how that will impact the amount of spend approved at council level. So we obtained the data on current open purchase orders, and based on the dollar amount of the purchase order, followed the current spending authority chart to identify how much of that would go through council. So based on the current policy, the estimate is that 92% of the spend had reached council. In particular, there was 60% of our purchases constituting 14 projects over $1 million. We conducted various scenarios of moving the spend authorities, and of them, the one that warranted a good balance of transparency to council while alleviating the red tape was with the thresholds used in the chart to the right. So the thresholds we used in this are as follows. The line manager remaining at the same 7,500, the director remaining the same at 15,000, but moving the commissioner up to 100,000 and moving the city manager in line with Moncton and part of EMY's recommendations at 150,000 for operating and 500,000 for capital. It was determined that it would not be prudent to adjust line manager and director at this time. The ultimate ownership of approved budgets sits with the commissioners, and as such, the focus was on the commissioner and city manager level. Using the same numbers, an alignment of expected approval was performed using other types of opportunities with amount of dollars spent. So I'm going to move to that slide next. So as you can see, we have the amount of purchases that would have gone through based on the current policy on the left. And then you see on the right with the recommended change. So as you can see from the slide, the amount of purchases that would go through at the council would be 30 versus the 103 under the old thresholds. So again, this is driven by the fact that a lot of our spend comes from a few purchases over $1 million. The other area that we see a lot more purchases as the final stop with the commissioner is within, and it's important to note that with the commissioner, it doesn't really change the level of work because they would have saw all those purchases anyway. It just would have been kind of a pass through to the next level. So it's just saying they are now the final stop. After reviewing the data, comparing to others, and reviewing our controls are in place, the draft recommendation is for the thresholds to be as follows. They'll stay the same for the line manager at 7,500. Stay the same for the director at 15,000, increase for commissioners from 25,000 to 100, and increase from 75,000 to 150 for operating and 500,000 for capital for the city manager. The third draft recommendation is to include delegation of approval authority within our policy and bylaws. All of the city contracts go to council for approval, and mayor and common clerk sign them and seal them. Many of these purchases would be for things similar to other purchases we have that just go through the purchase order system. The only trigger causing a lot of these contracts to go to council is the fact that the authority to approve a contract is with council. From EY recommendations, this topic is aligned with the ones highlighted in blue, which are the two on the right-hand side of the table. Expansion of signing authority beyond the mayor to include city manager, directors, and approved delegates and all non-budgeted items go to council. When performing our analysis of the options, it was noted that Moncton has a policy related to this practice where the council can delegate approval authority to the city manager, who may sub-delegate to others the awarding of contracts within their spending authorities. General counsel has performed the work to identify what we can legally do. The main item to note is the last bullet that describes the Local Governance Act section on the signing of contracts. All contracts of the city must be sealed with the corporate seal and signed by the mayor and the clerk. Because of the current requirements in the LGA, the city manager cannot physically sign the contract on the city's behalf. But legally, the delegation of awarding the contract can be given to the city manager, and then the mayor and the clerk can sign. Because of the way the LGA is written, there are two pieces that need to be included in the recommendation for contracts. First, we request that council allow the city manager to award contracts up to the city manager's spending authority, keeping in mind that the contracts will still go through all the significant steps of review by procurement and general counsel office. The only step removed will be the final step where they are submitted to council for approval. The second piece, which will have to be adjusted, is that general counsel, through a bylaw, will authorize the mayor and clerk to execute the contract, which was approved by the city manager. Essentially, it'll allow them to sign the contract without taking it to council. So those last three draft recommendations that we just went through are all part of the E&Y operational review of removing red tape, and in conjunction with our detailed review and update to our policy. These changes will move the city towards reallocating more time on the strategic purchasing and less time on red tape. Another exciting area that we will be giving more time and effort to is in social procurement. The city's social procurement goals are to build awareness of the importance of social procurement and provide the guidance on how to include social values within achieving the best overall value for taxpayers. It is also one way that the city can encourage social values that spread past the walls of our organization. We recognize that the social and sustainable procurement concepts are not yet ingrained in the city's current policy and practices. Today, we are presenting the revised wording to be included in the policy. The continued work and understanding of social procurement will continue to evolve. After reviewing other policies that incorporate social procurement and reviewing support from the consultants, this is the draft recommended wording for the procurement policy. The areas we are putting in policy to assist in making procurement decisions are listed as well below. Some of the areas we supported are the support of targeted employment strategies for people facing systemic barriers to employment, or organizations that support low carbon options, or organizations that provide a living wage. How we implement these considerations will depend on what we are procuring and will be outlined in our guidebook to staff. And as you can see in the first paragraph there, we're aligning on our city's climate action plan and also on our 10-year financial plan. Social procurement is not a simple implementation into our practices. There are constraints within the acts and regulations that dictate practices that we must follow, and as such, careful and consideration to the procedures for purchases have to be implemented. Because of the nature of this area, we will be working very closely with General Counsel on all the criteria and framework we decide to include in our procedures to staff. This slide just shows some of the work we have done on social procurement and what we plan to do next. After we attended the workshop on social procurement, it was clear the importance of engaging all staff on how to incorporate social considerations within their daily purchases. As such, further information and training will continue. The importance of engaging on social procurement is just as important with our potential suppliers and the taxpayers. Finding ways to inform them of our efforts and to understand the impact to suppliers will be very important in this continued rollout. The next draft recommendation is the inclusion of ethics statement in our policy. The statement is detailed on this slide along with specific areas to be considered. So our next steps are to continue to review and update the policy and inform you of significant changes. The draft recommendations we have presented today are some of the bigger changes and additions to policy. And now that the policy is almost complete, efforts will turn to the procurement guidebook. The procurement guidebook is what we know now as our procedures document internally. There will be a shift where our policy will provide more of our guiding principles, and our guidebook will be instructions to staff on how to carry out the policy and procurement activities. As the team goes through the guidebook, there will be many opportunities to engage with staff on how things will be carried out in real life and challenges that may be faced and how to resolve them. It will further help us understand where we need to include further assistance to staff, formalize templates, and where there are targeted opportunities to implement social procurement. Along with this work, there are many other areas within procurement that we are looking to enhance our offerings and continue to be strategic. This presentation is a receive and file, and we will return in the fall with revisions or additions to be approved in policy. So I think I have 3 minutes left. Thank you so much for patiently listening to me. Chris and Orlando are here as well to help with any questions you may have, and I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Director Forgy. Committee, questions and comments from committee, Your Worship?
I love it. I've always had an issue with, the lowest price. This certainly expands that role somewhat. And it's always been difficult, Jody, for things to come to council that meet all of the criteria except the money criteria, as far as who can authorize things. And so we just end up, voting for those things because we have to. So it's great to hear that out of it sounds like almost over 100 will not come to us anymore based on our new. So that's really fantastic. So no, it's great. I love it. Thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Your Worship. Councillor Radwin.
Thank you, Chair. I'm loving this too. I think we need to get rid of as much red tape as we can. It saves time, which in turn saves money. And, I think the 4 words that I did enjoy seeing the most was Ernst & Young recommendations. And I just hope I keep hearing those kind of things because they're experts and they've given some good recommendations. So I have a quick question. I'm just wondering, what the thought process was behind not actually using their exact recommendations. Just wondering, why did staff decide to follow the recommendations, but maybe not completely?
Okay, that's a great question, actually. So within their recommendation, they had recommended 500,000. The reason why we felt it was important to have a different limit on the operating budget is because when you look at the approval of the operating budget, it's more on an envelope, a total bucket basis for areas, where with capital budget, it's very specific to each project in particular. So it's a very granular approval on the capital budget. So we felt that it was more opportunity to expand it there. And in addition, a lot of our capital budget purchases would be a larger dollar value. So it hit the efficiency more on the capital side if we increased it versus the operating. And then also with their other recommendations, sorry, because there was their recommendation on the signing authority as well. Our LGA, and I'll let Orlando step in if I say it wrong, is very specific in New Brunswick that our mayor has to sign and we have to have a seal on the clerk. That's not common practice across all of Canada. I hear often when I speak to procurement experts out in Ontario and stuff, they say your city manager will sign the contract. We're not allowed to do that in New Brunswick.
Wow. No, that's some great information. And a good reminder, because sometimes that LGA is lengthy and such a legally binding document there, right? So no, that's really good insight, and I appreciate hearing from finance experts on these sorts of things. And I think it's a great move forward. Thank you, Director Forgy. That's wonderful.
City Manager, do you want a quick comment?
Yeah, just a very quick word of caution. Today is a receive and file. We're still going to do a little bit more modeling internally amongst the staff in terms of the various spending limits to see if we can even harmonize it a little bit more and eliminate a bit more red tape. I'm not sure we've got it 100% right just yet, the spending limits, but we will do that work before obviously it comes back for final review.
Thank you. Councillor Hickey, over to you.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks for the presentation, Jody. It's exciting to see a lot of this coming to fruition. I know a lot of it's been in discussion for quite some time. In particular, glad to see, how often do we at council sit around and go, geez, great project, but why is it all coming to us? So it's nice to see that process refined, and it's nice to see that will ultimately support staff. I guess not so much a question as much as a comment. I think everyone around the table knows how keen I have been on adopting some kind of social procurement policy. So I'm very excited to see that, and they're very excited to see that come to fruition, because I think, it's going to see its impact locally, and it's going to see its impact on those who receive our contracts, and make sure that we're holding them to certain standards too, whether it be the issues around them being local, them being environmentally sustainable, them being good to their workers, et cetera, et cetera. So a lots to unpack there, and particularly excited to see that beyond the other efficiencies that we're going to see out of it. So thank you, and keep it up. Looking forward to the full policy.
Thank you.
Councillor Norton.
Thank you, Worship. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Speaking of the mayor, I hope that practice continues in New Brunswick. I think it's good for transparency when we know that our mayor is signing off on that. I know from a staff perspective, it could be seen as just an extra layer of red tape. I guess from a purely citizen point of view, it's good to know that the citizen's representative is signing off on that. So although sometimes we look west for best practices, I hope it's something that the current legislation still I guess requires. Anyways, that's an aside. I shouldn't have gone there, but I do like it, and it's something I think should stick. Other than that, the mayor's already said it. It's good to see that we're going to start measuring value just beyond just the dollar amount, and I guess that's that social procurement piece. It's good to see that that's also embedded in the 10-year strategic plan that Councillor at Large Harris has been chairing, and so it's there, and we see it. We're starting to see it as part of how we do business. So it's more than just measuring value for dollars based on just the dollar cents, but how else it impacts us. So another good thing brought forward by our finance pros. I sometimes feel in this committee, I just listen. I'm wowed. It's a vetting process. I'm always impressed, and I guess it's professional learning for me more than anything on this committee. I never have a lot of critical or constructive things to say other than thank you for another good teaching. So appreciate it.
Well, thank you for those kind comments.
Yeah, I'll just add for really committee's ears on this. We saw a pretty in-depth presentation, but I know from previous discussion I had with the team on this that we are just seeing the tip of the iceberg of the work that goes into it. We are all on board with creating a social procurement policy part of our procurement, and the amount of work that the team has had to do, because as a municipality, it's not as simple. As a family, you can say, I want to go support this organization because of all these other reasons. At the end of the day, we're also responsible for taxpayer dollars. So the amount of work that has gone into enabling us to move forward with it is incredible. So a huge thank you to the team and all that iceberg below the surface that we're not seeing of work that you are doing for this. This is a receive and file, so I'll take a motion to receive and file. Councillor Radwin, Councillor Norton, all in favor, aye, or wave. Contrary minded, and carried. Just before we we close up for the day. First of all, thank you to staff and committee for taking your Friday afternoon for this finance committee meeting, for all of the work that everybody did in preparation. The amount of reports, actually, that's that part of that procurement policy means staff is going to have time that they don't have to create reports for us as council. All of it's good. We covered 3 different but incredibly important pieces on today's agenda, with looking at updating our long-term financial plan, which in my opinion is one of the cornerstones of the bounce back that the city of St. John has seen over the last few years, and staying on top of it, knowing it's a living document and continuing to update it. Great work. Thank you to staff for bringing that to us. Long discussion, but really important, with different views on our financial processes with regards to supporting and analyzing a significant grant request from the St. John Theatre Company. And you know what? If we sat around and all agreed with everything that came on, 1, it'd be pretty boring, and 2, we would not get the best decisions. So I'm incredibly proud of the team and staff for being perfectly comfortable coming in with different views to push us to the best possible answers. And then another policy that we're working on to strengthen our already strong financial plans and policies. So thanks. I always excited with working with this team. Thanks again. And with that, everybody enjoy your weekend, and I'll take a motion to adjourn. Our worship and Councillor Hickey, on favor. Have a great weekend, everybody. Thanks for your